There'd just be a mass of bodies, like a pyramid of human beings, a ziggurat of people writhing in front of the stage. And I get why. Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Ground Zero Salem. As always, I'm your host, Pat. Gonna talk about a recent spree, we'll say, I went on last year when I really wasn't making videos. A few people mentioned this when I talked about it in a recent update. I can't remember which one. Out of the 5 videos I've done in the past month or so, I mentioned that while I was away, I was listening to and buying up a lot of like chaotic 90s metallic hardcore, some stuff that kind of bridged the gap into almost kind of Screamo style stuff. How I filled a lot of holes in my collection on stuff that I missed out on because I was listening to other types of music when that stuff was big. A few people expressed interest in it, and I thought that might be a cool thing to explore because it was a big spree. It was months and months of me buying a bunch of this stuff up. And as a preamble for context, I thought I'd pull a bunch of my favorite hardcore records from the late 80s into the 90s to kind of chronicle for you the metal influence in hardcore. For brevity's sake, I'm going to avoid crust and power violence and genres like that altogether, simply because I talk about that stuff enough as it is, and I really wanted to get into the type of music that led into the stack of stuff that I bought when that was. It was like last spring into summer, I bought a ton of stuff off of Discogs. The nice thing about going on weird, feverish acquisition quests like that is that a lot of these CDs are very cheap. You know, there's not a ton of people clamoring for late 90s metallic hardcore stuff. It's an interesting kind of thing while I'm on the topic of calling it metallic hardcore. I never really heard the term metalcore until I was running my first distro, which was a in-person only distro that I brought to shows when I lived in Maine. I started hearing metalcore in reference to bands, well, a few bands that I'll be talking about. I'm not going to give that away. But otherwise, bands like Archangel, Unborn, stuff like that. This is a few years before 18 Visions and Poison the Well and bands of that nature. A lot of the Trustkill stuff really took off. And as soon as it did, it's kind of funny because metalcore became anathema to me. Like, I did not like most of the bands from that scene. I didn't really like going to see those bands play. I wasn't a big fan of the all the kickboxing stuff that was taking off, although I did partake in it a fair amount. I got more into the whole DIY kind of thing, way more that was going on. That was a revival of 80s hardcore. That was what I was most involved with because I got into hardcore punk in the early 90s as a metalhead that discovered GBH and bands like that because the metal bands I listened to wore their shirts. Biggest example being Metallica. Everybody knows that. And figuring out what crossover was. By the time I came along, crossover had been long gone, and hardcore had evolved into this sort of metallic genre, at least where I lived. So that was an interesting sort of thing. I was expecting Black Flag when I heard I was going to my first hardcore show, and the headliner, Hugh Upaside, kind of kind of got there, but all the opening bands were very much in that palm muted E chord dive bomb kind of metallic thing that was starting to blow up. So it was a bit of a shock to me. I liked some of that stuff, but I kind of jumped off in the end of the 90s. By like, I'd say about 96, 97 or so, when I was graduating high school, I was getting into the street punk scene and rediscovering and finding 80s hardcore bands that I hadn't heard yet, like Negative Approach and all that kind of stuff. And it was more exciting for me, that kind of music. So when there was a revival that came around about 4 years later when I was in my early 20s, I was way more excited about that than all this metallic stuff that was kind of fusing with metal and becoming more metal than it was hardcore in a lot of ways. But now, it being decades into the future, I thought I'd go through and talk about some of the stuff that I missed out on that I bought piles and piles of. There's a few glaring omissions here. I'm not really talking about Converge much in this, just because they've still yet to really grab me. I know that's kind of ridiculous for some people. They're such an important band to a lot of people that like this kind of music. I have their early records. I think they're good. They shred really hard, like fantastic musicians. There's some elements of the vocals I just can't get past, particularly the clean vocals that remind me almost of Guy from Rites of Spring. I don't like that guy's vocals. It's always been a stumbling block, and Jacob Bannon's clean vocals remind me of that a lot. I don't know what it is, but I digress. Bloodlet, because I've talked about him a bunch and I just didn't get around to pulling any of their stuff. Earth Crisis, very important. Talked about him last update. I'll put one of those little link things in the corner right now. So anyway, as a preamble, to give context, I want to talk about some of the most important records in my collection from the late 80s onward that kind of exemplify the evolution in this music and where it went and how it got to the stack of stuff that I bought today. That's what we're going to be doing today. So you can't really talk about hardcore, specifically hardcore coming out of New York and coming out of the youth crew scene evolving, without talking about a few bands. One of them is Beyond from Long Island. A bunch of these guys went on to do a lot of stuff that was very influential and very important, which I'll talk about. The guitarist Tom Capone was a metalhead when he joined the band. Alan Cage went on to be in a bunch of bands, including Quicksand, incredible drummer. Vic DeCara, great bass player. But they were taking something that wasn't too dissimilar to the fast hardcore that Youth of Today was playing, which was, even at its own time, a revival of Boston hardcore and Negative Approach and stuff like that. They were ironically kind of rebelling against the crossover movement. There was a big distaste for metalheads in New York at the time, according to everything I've read. I was not around. So it's kind of funny how metal kind of snuck its way back in different ways. Beyond took that Youth of Today kind of vibe, some early DC hardcore like Minor Threat, and also some more current day DC hardcore for the time, like Dag Nasty, who I think were going pretty strong when this was recorded, and maybe some of the Revolution summer stuff, like some of the more melodic DC hardcore. And they involved metal in a really tasteful way with a lot of gallops, a little bit of like kind of Iron Maiden stuff going on. A few moments almost feel kind of crossover, like the song Vitality. You know, it almost could have been maybe an SOD song or something like that, but the musicianship level was almost virtuoso, at least for hardcore punk at the time, especially with a bunch of teenagers playing it. But it was melded in such a way that was way more seamless, that it felt less like cut and paste, here's a mosh part, here's a hardcore part, which I feel like a lot of like earlier crossover bands like Cryptic Slaughter and SOD, you could tell what they intended to be metal about it and what they intended to be hardcore. That's my interpretation anyway. You know, crossover in itself I think was a great idea and did actually probably unify a lot of people, but it feels like a very deliberate decision, or something that maybe just needed to happen culturally, whereas after it left its impact, bands like Beyond just kind of took hardcore and like put a little bit of a metal spin on it without it being blatant, you know what I mean? Another good example of that is Judge, which, I mean, if you've heard of New York hardcore at all, you've heard of Judge. If you know about the straight edge scene, you should know Judge. Their 7-inch really wasn't very metal at all, but their full length, bringing it down, it was only metal tinged, I'd say, but it had a lot of metal dynamics. You could feel the kind of theatric, ride the lightning-ishness to it. You know, it's very dramatic. The riffs are huge, and the production really serves it too. It feels like an epic, angry youth crew record from New York. It has just a certain level of dramatic flair to it, and it's very good. Of course, there's, you know, a little bit of choking up on the E and some solos and stuff like that, but that's another example of metal kind of creeping in a different direction in New York. At the same time, you had Sheer Terror. This is Just Can't Hate Enough, their debut. This was on Blackout Records. It was on a couple of different labels, a German label called Starving Missile. There's a bunch of different pressings of this. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. Personal great for me. I've listened to it probably thousands of times. But this was super unique because it took that ugly negative approach, SOA from DC, just this mean, rough-vocaled hardcore, and more or less fused it perfectly with Celtic Frost. Again, could be considered crossover in a sense, but in such a weird way that nobody ever did before or since, in my opinion. Maybe a little bit of Darkside NYC is kind of similar, but that's the same guitarist, Alan Blake, who played on this, so that's kind of cheating. But he completely took the Hellhammer early Celtic Frost guitar tone and threw it into a hardcore mix. Paul's vocals on this, Paul Bear, the vocalist, really gruff, like mean-sounding vocals, but does cleans in it as well that are, again, completely unique, completely singular. Went on to influence a ton of vocalists, including Life of Agony, I mean, much later on, Twitching Tongues and stuff like that. Just anything that was kind of like a croon or a bluesy kind of deal. They have a certain mournful quality that's just incredible on this. And yeah, just very, very, very unique for its time. Also, I'd be a fool if I didn't mention the East Coast Assault comp. This came out on Too Damn Hype Records, I think in 92, but it's just a rogues gallery of all this scary metallic hardcore coming out of the East Coast. Just a few of the names on it. Life of Agony, Went to Be Huge, of course. Berserker, Sam Blackchurch, Converge, very early Converge. Speaking of them, before they got into this sort of like almost pseudo-technical grind, hardcore, whatever stuff that they did later, they were more of a straight-up NYHC band with a metallic bent, like not too dissimilar from like Biohazard, but with Rorschach kind of vocals. So they're on it. The aforementioned Darkside's on it. Marauder, one of my favorites. Edgewise, Starkweather, who I'll talk about in a moment. Confusion, Demise, early example of using Slayer riffs in New York hardcore. Great bunch of demos from that band. Bricklayer. So this is a good showing of, I think it was just making things heavier and meaner, involving metal. The dance floors were really, really scary then, from what I'm told. In Syracuse, they were not too bad, but I think downstate they were pretty brutal. And the soundtrack for that kind of accommodated it. Of course, integrity was really important for metal breaking into hardcore. It's kind of taking a couple of different ingredients and fusing them in a way that hadn't happened yet. It's taking the Judge formula. Bands that were also somewhat metallic from New York, namely Cro-Mags and Judge, and throwing way more occult influence into it. Dwid, the vocalist, was obsessed with the Church of Final Judgment, Church of Holy Terror, sometimes as it's called, that was a weird cult in the late 60s in California that believed that God and the devil were in cahoots to destroy humanity. Really interesting read if you want to check out, Google some of that stuff. He was really into Charles Manson too. And it was these guys and Ringworm, who we'll talk about in a second, who were, you know, I think some of the guys were straight edge at one point and then weren't anymore. And it was this whole kind of like, we're the evil guys kind of vibe from them in the early 90s. And both bands kicked so much ass in those days. This is a great record. It's not my favorite. Probably Systems Overload at the end of the day is my favorite Integrity, but this was so cool because it took that epicness that Judge kind of borrowed from some metal bands and injected more metal into it. There's a lot of Slayer, there's a lot of Metallica, pretty heavy growled / whispered creepy and evil vocals, courtesy of Dwid, who just keeps sounding better, by the way. He started to get a little bit more oomph behind his voice in the records past this, and he still sounds incredible. I saw Integrity at the Decibel Metal and Beer Fest about 5-6 years ago, and he sounded even better. I don't know how you sing like that and maintain it for so long. But yeah, excellent combination of New York hardcore and dark metal influence. Can't mention Cleveland and that kind of stuff without mentioning Ringworm as well. I'm holding that wrong. Without mentioning Ringworm as well. This is The Promise. This was one of the first things I bought after I started going to hardcore shows. Right after it came out, 93. It's such a weird combination of influences. Completely different from Integrity, except vocally you can hear some similarities. Human Furnace kind of sounds like a possessed mix of Ray Capo and John Joseph from the Cro-Mags. It's this kind of snarled, kind of New York hardcore thing, but he sounds like a man possessed. And the music also, like some of the riff structures feel kind of Youth Crew-ish, but also there's blast beats all over it. Apparently their bassist was a big fan of a lot of the Slap a Ham stuff and some grind, so that wove its way in. There's some tremolo picking. Really under-distorted guitars, which a lot of people don't like, but I find to be very charming, kind of in the same way that I like the weird guitars on Game Over by Nuclear Assault. And it's a quick one. I mean, it's maybe just a little bit over 20 minutes. And the lyrics are super weird, talking about cesspools of embryonic scum, and I've touched the face of God, and it is cold, and it is dead. Like, it's really dark stuff, but it's got that hardcore punk energy to it. Going back to New York, rather the tri-state area, New York and New Jersey, I know the members kind of moved in and out of the city. You can't mention metal and hardcore being merged without talking about Rorschach. These are their 2 LPs, Remain Sedate and Protestant. Remain Sedate's a little bit faster. You can still hear the kind of 80s hardcore influence with the speed department in that. But odd timing, odd kind of structures. There's some Voivod going on with the influence guitar-wise. There's Die Kreutzen too. And those two have their own similarities too as well. Maybe early Neurosis too. I think the two bands, were friends and stuff like that. And shredded vocals. Every metalcore vocalist that did it up to present of a certain style owes everything to Charles Maggio. Larynx just falling out. Shrieking, strangulated, just having a nervous breakdown kind of approach to vocals. It sounds... The thing with Charles, though, is that it sounds very genuine. I think a lot of those people that kind of tried to do that vocal style, especially throughout the 90s into the early 2000s, just kind of ended up sounding like strangled chickens or something like that. I'd say that Charles sounds almost completely inhuman. Just really, really something. The follow-up Protestant is a lot more kind of slower pace and weird, and it's got a very suffocating air to it. But both are completely mandatory if you want to get into any of the stuff that I'm talking about beyond this. I mean, they're the blueprint for so many bands, including Converge, which I'm sure the members would readily admit, and Acme and the German stuff and everything that came after this. Super important. Also, on the West Coast, you had, I didn't pull their 7-inch, it's very, very good. You had bands like Downcast and Struggle, which were, early Ebullition Records bands that were very, very political, very left-leaning, and involved like a lot of heavy chugga-chugga, E-chord, stompy parts, which was a new thing at the time. And I kind of think about it, I think like a lot of things, the whole approach to guitar can't be really placed on one band like anything. I mean, no doubt that the people that utilized that sort of guitar approach probably got it from that middle break in Raining Blood by Slayer. But as far as the early bands that did it, there's a couple of culprits, let's put it that way. Inside Out, featuring Vic DeCara, who was in Beyond, moved out to the West Coast, and Zach De La Roca from Rage Against the Machine. This is a good example of when hardcore started to slow down and get a little bit more dissonant and a little bit more metallic. And I think it served the vocals, served the lyrics rather, where it was all these really intense personal lyrics about, you know, whatever, not backing down from anything and that sort of deal. No spiritual surrender, it says right there. You know, it's very intense lyrics, intense vocals, and the more simmering kind of quality of the music and the riffs served that better, I believe. You also had No Escape, which would feature Tim Singer from Dead Guy on vocals. This is a compilation called Rebuilding. No Escape was also very stompy, low-end, crunchy, you know, occasional fast part, but pretty metallic. This Rebuilding comp is a really, really good snapshot of what was going on with hardcore in the late 80s and early 90s. This is a CD version that has a couple of different comps together on it. It's got the out-of-print Rebuilding 7-inch, the Turning Point No Escape split, and bonus tracks from the out-of-print Forever 7-inch, which is weird. The Forever 7-inch has Turning Point and No Escape and Burn, but doesn't include Rorschach and Born Against for whatever reason on this that easily could have fit. I don't know why. They took those off, whatever. The only outlier on this is Gorilla Biscuits. You know, that's a very 80s sound that they had. It was very fast, you know, kind of upbeat and melodic. Doesn't really fit with everything else on here, although I will say that Turning Point comes from that melodic, fast Youth Crew thing as well. They just started to get more dramatic with their guitar riffs and a lot more intricate with... It wasn't just all power chords after a while. They definitely got to, like, again, probably a metal level of musicianship, but not necessarily the music itself. They also started to slow down a lot. The Gorilla Biscuits song on this is almost like a hyper-fast, nearing crossover kind of song. Biscuit Power, great song. But you have Turning Point, Gorilla Biscuits, No Escape, and Burn. So I bought this when I was on that jag of wanting to get more and more stuff. I became obsessed with Burn for a couple of weeks. Have the 7-inch, but I had to get the little slipcase CD. This is the self-titled 7-inch. This band's got a lot of stuff out, spanning over decades and decades. They recorded this, and then they didn't come out with anything for many years. They came out with, I want to say, another EP. I can't remember exactly when, but I'll put a caption saying when. I think it was in the late 90s. They've put out a whole bunch of records over the years. They're all very good. Kind of like Rorschach, the guitarist Gavin Von Vlack was a big fan of stuff like Voivod. You know, he brought in almost kind of like proggy influence of hardcore in a way. This is still rooted in the 80s. It's got a lot of fast stuff in it, but there's a lot of kind of subdued parts, some clean guitar even here and there. There's almost some sort of spoken word elements going on with the vocals and the lyrics. It feels very massive for how short it is. It's only 4 songs. It's over in whatever, 10 to 15 minutes. But they do so much with that short amount of time. It's a wonderful recording. During this period, they only did 2 other songs, which are on that other CD from various comps, and then they were just kind of done for a long time. You can find some live footage. A lot of people get really nerdy with the old NYHC bands and collect sets of theirs from CBGBs and from the Crucial Chaos radio show and stuff like that. They have a lot of not a lot. They have a certain amount of unreleased songs that are pretty astounding. A few that are super fast and crazy sounding that I really like to get a hold of. I wish they had proper recordings of. But yeah, I mean, Burn, incredible. They certainly got a bit slower as they went on, kind of developed their riffs a little bit more, got a little bit heavier, thicker production, that sort of thing, as you do, but all of it's very good. Forgot to mention, Alan Cage from Beyond was also the drummer in Burn. Important to note, also the drummer in Quicksand, part of the whole post-hardcore thing, which I think was an industry term. I think people still use that term, but in regards to other types of music, it initially was slapped on a couple of bands that involved hardcore dudes that were playing more riff-heavy, sort of alternative rock stuff where you could still, one way or the other, kind of taste the background in punk and hardcore. They're kind of influenced by some indie rock stuff too. Very interesting stuff. This is a great record. There's also bands like Handsome and a handful of others that were around in the 90s, but Quicksand were great. Alan Cage played drums in them, and he also played drums in Seaweed, so wanted to throw that out there. Wow, I've already been talking for 20 minutes here. I haven't even gotten to the stack yet. Providing context. So a few more, just to set the stage. And these are bands that I've liked for a long time. Resurrection was a band that I saw a bunch of times. First couple years I went to shows at the Lost Horizon. They were from Jersey. They were interesting. I remember hearing them and I thinking, this is just like noise. It just sounds like they're hitting their instruments and yelling. I couldn't discern any riffs. They were kind of an outlier, at least within the straight edge scene. They were more influenced by Rorschach, State Mates, I guess, and also maybe Neurosis too, and probably some noise rock. You can see the noise rock influence kind of creeping in throughout the 90s. But yeah, they had like some ugly feedback and some weird song structures, some odd kind of rhythmic structures, some pretty like pained vocals, courtesy of Rob Fish. Their full length had horrible production, and I tried listening to it and it was super buried sounding and awful. And what was great was that they kept the original reels and all that and completely remixed it, and it sounds great. It's included. This is like a double LP discography. I think you can still get it for pretty cheap. I got it from State of Mind Recordings for like $8, like a little while ago, but it was put out by Death Wish, Jacob Bannon from Converge's label, and it's certainly worth a listen. Rob Fish went on to be in 108, a Krishnacore band, who were very, very intense. So the aforementioned Tim Singer, he sang for Dead Guy. Dead Guy has been a favorite of mine for a long time. When they were around, I was not super into it. I specifically remember writing in a zine that I never put out. I was writing about an awesome band that I love called Devoid of Faith from Albany. And Devoid of Faith had some feedback and some noise. They were way more of a faster Japanese hardcore and Neurosis and kind of crust influenced hardcore band. But they had a noisy element to them. And I remember saying, like, this should be the real noisecore people are talking about, not that Dead Guy shit. But to be honest, Dead Guy were brilliant, and it just took me years to really appreciate them. Probably didn't really start to get into them till I was pushing 30. Just a very paranoid kind of atmosphere. Lots of weird use of like high-end, I don't know, I'm not a guitarist, but like guitar harmonics and stuff like that over this sort of jagged rhythmic approach, and a singer just ranting and freaking out with a very hoarse bellow. Great band. They were super into noise rock. You can hear the amphetamine Reptile influence with a lot of their stuff. They probably dug Jesus Lizard and Big Black and all those kinds of bands. I'm not super familiar with a lot of that stuff, but I did buy the early Big Black and Jesus Lizard stuff when I went through this little jag, just because I feel like I should educate myself. I know that stuff's important. I don't know if I'm too old to really get into that kind of thing, but I enjoyed, the Big Black and Jesus Lizard stuff that I got. I need to spend a little bit more time with it. But yeah, you can certainly hear that weird, discordant, smashy, almost weirdly kind of industrial. And I mean industrial in the very early sense of like, here's tape loops of people breaking shit, not, dance synths or whatever. Really crushing stuff. And then a band that I always love is Starkweather from Philly. Very early example, very, very early example of a band playing in the hardcore scene that was almost a straight up metal band. Dudes that were part of the hardcore scene for sure, but again, certainly metal level talent. The vocalist has such a weird approach that went back and forth from a growl, a rasp that was almost death metal. Maybe like a little bit more discernible, less vomity John Tardy, and then would go to these weird, haunting, clean vocals that were somewhere between King Diamond and Richie Birkenhead from Underdog or something like that, or HR from the Bad Brains. Very in its own pocket, odd, meandering, but really haunting song structures. Longer songs too. I'm sure you could probably mosh to this band. There's some hard parts or whatever, but that's not the point of like what they were doing. And they've been around forever. They're very sparse with their output, but they put out a couple of full lengths in the past like 20 years that are awesome. They had one on Death Wish and another one on a big metal label. I want to say, I'm not sure. I want to say Metal Blade or Century Media or one of those. And then the last one that I pulled to talk about, as far as at least LPs here, as far as important influences and what kind of pushed all of this forward, creating metallic hardcore, metalcore, yada, yada, yada. Unbroken, Life, Love, Regret. This is an all-day vape for me. I love this record. They had an LP previous to this that was kind of metallic. It was kind of metallic in the same way that Strife is, and the first Earth Crisis 7 inches, where, a little bit more, tighter picking, everything was pretty accomplished musicianship-wise. There's some kind of chugging in it, that you wouldn't hear on a Negative Approach record, metallic guitar tone. But this, they straight up almost completely crib a bunch of Slayer riffs, specifically South of Heaven era Slayer riffs, the real kind of creepy kind. All the lyrics are about a lot of personal struggles, depression, suicidal ideation, corporatism, capitalism, that kind of stuff. And then after this, they went far more in the direction of a lot of their San Diego compatriots, getting a little bit more kind of chaotic rhythmically. They were probably friends with and listening to a lot of the Gravity Records bands, which I'll put a link to it in the description. I did a collection update on all the Screamo stuff. I had another wormhole I went down on, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years ago, where I bought a ton of Gravity Records stuff and got super into bands like Heroin and Angel Hair and all that. I did kind of re-explore a lot of that stuff to gauge the sonic similarities of those bands and some of the stuff I listened to, and that Gravity Records stuff is way more punk than a lot of this. I kind of remembered it being very like bashy and chaotic, but there's kind of a lot of fast, like old school hardcore in it than I remembered. But anyways, yeah, Unbroken brought a lot of the Slayer in there for sure. I'm going to be talking about some European bands, and I thought this band was worth mentioning too. I just dug this out. Ironside from England. Most of this was recorded between 92 and 93. There's 13 songs. It's like an EP and a couple of demos or something like that. These were British guys that were obsessed with Integrity at the time. You can hear a huge Integrity influence. It's even got like a creepy sample of like a serial killer before it kicks off, which is exactly what Integrity has on their first album that I just showed. It's like a Manson sample. It's a little bit more sludgy than Integrity, a little bit more bottom heavy. It's got these sort of like bass breaks that go into fast parts and a lot of things that are emblematic about faster hardcore, New York hardcore and that kind of thing. But it's definitely starting to lean in more of a bottom heavy, leaning into like sludge kind of territory here and there in bits. It makes sense because the bands that came out of Ironside, there were many, but the two big ones that come to mind are Iron Monkey, who were the British version of I Hate God, and Hard to Swallow, who kind of mixed sludgy, Sabbathy stuff with hyperfast grind, power violence kind of stuff. So not a lot of people talk about Ironside. I guess they went over to Belgium and played, I think it's called Leperfest. There was a big hardcore fest in Belgium that happened for years. They played over there early on, and not long after that, a lot of the Belgian bands started to get very Slayerish and very metallic, a lot of the hardcore bands. So I read an interview with them where they were talking about how they might have had something to do with that. And there's an Ian Glasper book, the guy who writes all the books about British hardcore and all that, on 90s hardcore in Britain, and it's really good, like all of his books are. Very informative. So while we're on the topic of the Belgian bands, why don't we start with that? That was kind of the beginning of this deep dive into the 90s that I embarked upon, was remembering to myself, oh yeah, I gotta pick up and check out some of that Hate Thousand stuff. So for the uninitiated, the Hate Thousand scene was this couple of bands, small scene of bands from Belgium from the late 90s that played incredibly metallic hardcore, barely recognizable as hardcore anymore, which was kind of a big deal at the time. They really pushed it forward even further than their predecessors, even further than Integrity or Ironside or Bloodlet or any bands like that. Mostly in the speed department. They really kicked it in with like a little bit of Swedish death metal and black metal. The Melodeath thing was just kind of taking off. It wasn't really even influencing hardcore bands yet. There's a lot of like even Teutonic thrash in it, combined here and there with the Victory Records mosh a little bit. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by how much fast and thrashiness there is in both of these records. You've got Congress, Black and Persistence, and Liar Invictus. Both are fantastic. Fast, mostly metallic hardcore with good crunch and good breakdowns and kind of sulfuric almost kind of black metal kind of vocals. I don't know if it was a common thing or just for one gig, but there was a guy that wore, it was the bass player, wore full corpse paint when he played in Congress. And I don't know if it was a gag. I mean, I know that these guys really liked black metal, but it's just kind of funny to see like one dude in corpse paint and a bunch of hardcore kids. And then there was a couple of German bands that were similar kind of brother bands that played together. I think they had a split from Germany that started maybe a few years after these bands were already going, these Belgian bands. Caliban and Heaven Shall Burn. They got their start in the very late 90s and continued on well into the 2000s. I think both bands are still playing. Both bands got pretty big. Both got on big metal labels. Century Media, I think, was one of them. And I like them both. It's definitely the beginning of, this sort of more formulaic metalcore kind of sound. This is the era when metalcore became a industry term, I think. Very, very end of the 90s, very early 2000s. This does involve like more melodeath stuff, both of these records. I'd say Heaven Shall Burn might have a little bit more gratuitous mosh from what I remember. And it's enjoyable. There's certainly a lot more like Gothenburg kind of influence creeping in with this stuff. And I know that there was tons of crossover between that. I saw The Haunted with a bunch of kind of tough guy metallic hardcore bands in the mid 2000s. You'd have In Flames touring with whoever, hardcore bands and stuff like that. And I think part of the reason for that were bands like this. I mean, it wasn't too long after these bands started, they were playing really big festivals. And they were, from the hardcore scene more or less. They were vegan, straight edge. Lyrics were more or less political, at least in the beginning. But yeah, good riffs. You could tell there's a lot of gratuitous mosh, though. Like, we wrote, there's this China crash, you know what's going to happen next. Oh shit, like that kind of thing. But fun, enjoyable. Then I kind of start thinking about the bands that are from the US that I kind of had in mind. A little bit more on the chaotic side. Yeah, some Stealing Slayer riffs, but there's almost like a death metal technicality thrown in there, along with maybe some influence from the aforementioned San Diego bands, this sort of like kind of crazy, chaotic rhythmic approach, non-conventional kind of drum patterns and that sort of stuff. A band that people don't talk about a lot, were great, were Piecemeal from Massachusetts. And I bought this because I was like, oh yeah, my old roommate loved this band. And it's super chaotic. You got those kind of Charles Maggio, Rorschach kind of vocals. You could see how maybe they were listening to some of the Bremen, Germany stuff like Acme, who are also totally worth mentioning. Acme, I didn't pull any of their stuff, but sounds like a mix of Rorschach and Slayer playing in hell. Despite everything, there's still some traditional, maybe not specifically Boston, but traditional 80s hardcore fast parts here and there thrown in. Some dramatic talking, which is kind of the part of all of this that I'm not the biggest fan of. They're kind of like, oh, this is what's going on right now with me. I'm yelling again. I'm not super into that, but thankfully they keep that to a minimum, Also some great drumming. There's all these like a good like triplet thrown in or a little bit of double bass rolling by to kind of spice things up. Pretty cool band. A lot of variation in the songwriting. What's kind of cool and almost like the West Coast equivalent of Piecemeal was Adamantium. Very similar in a lot of ways, maybe less fast. There is some kind of stuff that almost gets like traditional hardcore in spirit about halfway through the record, which is cool, and also the tasteful little bits of double bass drumming. Also, similar vocal style that I mentioned previously. Nice dramatic, almost fade to blacky kind of Metallica fade to black-ish style acoustic part to one of the songs on there. That's great. And then you kind of get to the bands that really nailed it. Of course, Converge, even though I'm not a fan of the vocals and I can't get into a lot of the stuff, they did that chaotic stuff really well. And then you talk about Cave In, who are like one of the best to do it. This is Beyond Hypothermia. It's a compilation of early material. Their full length, Until Your Heart Stops, is incredible as far as this chaotic metalcore, metallic hardcore, whatever you want to call it. A lot of stop on a dime, change-ups, great mosh parts, but they don't last very long. They're a band that keeps you guessing. They can play fast, they can play slow, voice box falling out, everything you could possibly want. A lot of really technically adept playing on it. Interesting, they did kind of an about face. They did a kind of weird transitionary EP, and then they did a record called Jupiter as their second full length that was completely space rock. They heard the Failure record and just went off in a different direction. Then you got Burn It Down from Indiana. Again, this is sort of chaotic, but it's drawing back a little bit from all the other stuff. It's a little bit more of a straightforward chug mosh kind of fest, but there's enough thrown in where it's kind of not the same deal as a Despair or Chokehold or something like that. There's more formed riffs in it. They kind of have a few quiet parts here and there. It's very political too. There's like a recommended reading list in the thanks notes, which is cool. And also, members went on to be in Gates of Slumber, which is pretty cool. I like Gates of Slumber a lot, and interesting to have that connection, you know? See, hardcore kids can play metal, real metal fine. Then I kind of think of stuff that's also chaotic, but getting more into a noisy category, more related to, I don't know, something a little bit more dissonant, stuff that's more influenced by Dead Guy, I guess, you know, in terms of the wild drumming style and the really emotionally disturbed kind of approach to it, to the music. This is Coalesce, Give Them Rope. This is the remastered, remixed version of Give Them Rope. Yeah, Give Them Rope, she said 2.0. I believe they had some kind of beef with how it was originally recorded and it was redone. But yeah, just incredibly heavy, thick guitars. It's mid-paced. The drums are doing stuff I do not understand at all. So are the guitars. It's just mauling you. Really, really deep, pained vocals. Just an emotionally intense and almost kind of disturbingly heavy band. On a similar note, you've got All Else Failed. This is Archetype. This band was from Philly. My old band had the pleasure of opening for them very, very early on. They used to have 2 singers in their early days. Their first 7-inch came out. And as far as energy live, like, everybody was just, like, jumping off of each other's backs and freaking out and throwing their guitars around. And they were impressive live, to be sure. And they've kept that up. I mean, everybody I know that's seen them in Philly just adores them. But yeah, very, very odd, discordant, weird chord structures, all kinds of like cycling kind of drums and pounding almost kind of tribal rhythms, and just ranting, freaking out, hoarse shouted vocals. This is probably my favorite record of theirs. A Most Bitter Season is also really good. They have a certain depressive element that's great. I mean, they're chaotic and noisy, like Coalesce are, but there's something kind of dreary about them that I really like. The lyrics are not positive. Endeavor, Constructive Semantics. This was kind of a nice surprise. I always heard about this band and never really checked them out. This is a Trustkill band, but Trustkill kind of got known for doing that sort of commercial metalcore stuff later. This is almost like straight up hardcore. I almost didn't put it in the stack. It's a little bit, it's weird enough and noisy enough to throw in with everything. But this is mostly kind of thrashy and fast. Their previous record, Crazier Than a Shithouse Rat, which is a great title, was a little bit more towards the Dead Guy end of things. I think Dead Guy was just patient zero for all this stuff, all these weird approaches rhythmically and with odd guitar phrasing and all that. Also, I forgot to mention, Dead Guy had members of Rorschach, which explains a few things, and also later on Human Remains, which is cool. But Endeavor, yeah, like a touch of that sort of weird, noisy, or dissonant kind of approach, but also mostly fast, you know, and like typical kind of raw-throated hardcore vocals. Then we're getting into stuff that's like almost what the kids would call hardcore adjacent, but not quite. I mean, it's heavy enough and firmly 1 foot in hardcore enough to still say it's part of hardcore, was part of hardcore. We got Botch, We Are the Romans, and Knut, Terraformer. I feel like these are pretty close in sound. Again, this almost kind of feels like a more burly, violent version of Big Black or something like that to me. It's distorted, it's got weird rhythmic approaches, very raw, screamed vocals. But it's got enough kind of odd musical structures where it really does feel like a hardcore version of noise rock or something like that. Knut is similar. Knut gets a little bit more, if that's correct pronunciation. I thought these guys were from Seattle, and I had to correct it in the description. It's actually, they're from Europe, but also kind of, you know, spastic, all over the place, random hits, you know, kind of heavy, odd, but more sludgy in the approach of their writing, I feel. So that's cool. And a few more. We got Anodyne. This was a band from New York, late 90s. Members went on to be in that band Tombs, who were a relapse band for a long time. Kind of, I never really listened to them much, but I gathered they were sort of a dirgy, sludgy kind of thing. You can hear where Anodyne would eventually kind of merge into that. I feel like this is a way heavier end of Screamo-ish kind of stuff. You can hear sort of a Gravity Records influence, but there's also a throbbing, almost kind of sludgy heaviness to it. There Were Wires. This band just had a reunion. They were from Massachusetts, late 90s into the early 2000s. Again, you know, discordant, screamy, off-time kind of hits, really weird, unconventional rhythms and all that sort of thing. A little bit more punk, though. A little bit faster than some of that stuff. Pretty heavy bottom end sound, though. Like, really, really good guitar tone. Speaking of stuff that was way more punk in spirit, you got Reversal of Man from Florida. I picked this up because I was selling it in my distro, and I figured I'd grab one for myself. This is Medicine. Yeah, this is far more like political DIY approaching kind of stuff, but you could tell they were taking a lot of nods from San Diego, maybe some of the DC stuff too, making it a little bit faster and angrier. Inhumanity, the Great American Teenage Suicide Rebellion. This was a band from South Carolina that were around in the, I think, mid-90s till early 2000s. This is a discography CD of everything they did. These guys, tongue-in-cheek, I think, refer to themselves as emo violence, along with a handful of other bands. I also picked up an LP by them. The History Behind the Mystery, Music to Yourself by. What I like about this one in particular, their previous record was called The Nutty Antichrist, and that was a little bit more, like, silly. Obviously, it had, like, Jerry Lewis with, like, horns on the cover and stuff. And this still is tongue-in-cheek. It doesn't take itself too seriously lyrically or anything like that. But they're obviously going for kind of a weird, sort of occult, mysterious occult kind of vibe, which I really enjoy. It's got some odd instrumentation that's not your typical guitars, bass, drums sort of stuff. I can't tell if it's a zither or something like that, but there's some odd atmospheric background stuff going on in the music that I like a lot. All kinds of pentagrams and tarot cards and that kind of thing thrown in here. So I found that appealing. That's another repurchase. I had that back in the day when it came out and didn't really get it, so had to buy it. And also carrying along with that theme of this sort of screamy stuff, a Florida band called Scrotum Grinder, who shared members with Inhumanity at one point. I'm not sure which ones, but Florida band, the Tampa scene at the time, I think people involved in this were also in Failure Face and a bunch of other bands from down there that were prominent at the time. And it's almost kind of like a bunch of kids that were into a lot of maybe the more screamo side of things and probably power violence and DIY stuff, doing their interpretation of grind. So it's not really grind in the same way that you would say, Terrorizer's grind or something like that. But it's short, fast, heavy kind of songs with more of a hardcore kind of influence going on. And then Burnt by the Sun. This is Dave Whitty, Human Remains, Municipal Waste, and Discordance Axis, and some others. Legendary drummer in Philly, doing basically a way more metal-leaning version of the kind of chaotic hardcore stuff I was talking about. Whether we're talking about Dead Guy or Coalesce or something like that, it's faster and it's more metal tone-wise, but it's also got that sort of like insane vibe to it that a lot of that hardcore stuff did. This band was on Relapse for a long time. I never really listened to them, so I wanted to just grab this. It's a fantastic record. I have not mentioned the names of like half of these. I'm going to put up so many captions. I am bad at my job. Oh, Soundtrack to the Personal Revolution is the name of it. But yeah, they have a bunch of records, and they're all really good. And then just to talk about the early 2000s, just for a couple of releases, I have the Backstabbers Inc. Kamikaze Missions. CD, this is fast. This is bordering on like almost like grind or something like that, but it has that chaotic noisiness to it that kind of scratched the itch for this little buying spree that I went on. This band was from New Hampshire. They actually had a couple of people that were in December Wolves and members of Trap Them as well. But yeah, kind of chaotic, noisy, very fast metallic hardcore stuff. Good record, another repurchase. Had it back in the day, got rid of it. And then a band that I used to gig with them a lot, that I saw a bunch of times that were pretty scary live, just because a lot of the people that mosh for them were, into punching you in the face, is the Red Chord, Fused Together in Revolving Doors. This is such a good record. It's a very early example of taking brutal death metal. This is before slam was really even a thing, too. I would say taking brutal death metal, like, I know these guys played with bands like Skinless and Internal Bleeding, I believe, back in the day, and mixing it with this sort of like chaotic, technical, metallic hardcore stuff, and the results were pretty impressive, pretty heavy, death metal growls for vocals for the most part, and insane breakdowns, lots of really technically adept, fast stuff going on with it. Death metal hardcore, a very early example and good example of it. Also, last but not least, I'll mention, pick this up for the distro too. Sold out now. This is my copy. Ebullition reissued the Orchid, self-titled. Orchid's earlier material, Chaos Is Me, the 10-inch and stuff like that, was a little bit like faster and crazier. This has its really chaotic moments, but there's a lot more kind of a bigger riffs and stuff like that happening with this. But they were a Screamo band from Boston, political 90s hardcore Screamo band that were really, really impressive. I got to catch them once. They were supposed to play with His Hero Is Gone, who didn't show up until everybody had left and played to like 10 people. And I missed His Hero Is Gone, which makes me sad. Oh yeah, and I also have a small stack. This is it. After this, we're done, I promise. You can go right after this. Just a couple more minutes. It'll be fine. I picked up a few things that were kind of inspirational to bands like this, and because that these guys weren't just sitting around listening to the first Agnostic Front record. They were taking influence from metal, they were taking influence from noise rock, they were taking influence from alternative, and a few of the bands that I know hardcore bands were listening to at the time. One was definitely Helmet. Like, this Meantime record was the biggest thing in the world when it came out. The videos were constantly playing on Headbangers Ball and 120 Minutes. They came out of that whole noise rock thing, super heavy, tight, thudding, crunchy riffs, almost mechanically put together in a rhythmic sense, but not industrial. These guys were super important. I think the sound of hardcore changed overnight when they came out. Clutch, the first Clutch, before they became like a space rock band or whatever. This is like groovy hard rock. It was very, very heavy with like weird crooning but like growly kind of vocals. 70s influence, like riff structure wise, kind of 70s hard rock riffs. Kind of a cool record, not necessarily my thing, but I always meant to give it a shot because I liked that Shogun Named Marcus song back in the day. What they turned into later, nothing that I'm interested in. This was a repurchase. I learned to love this band again. This is Looking Glass Self by Snapcase. For years, I only swore by the first 7-inch, which bummed a lot of people out because a lot of people kind of universally pan the first 7-inch. They don't like it. I think it's great. I think it's a good example of like early 90s crunchy hardcore, kind of one step away from stuff like Biohazard. Not the same level of playing ability, but just kind of like real kind of street level crunchy metallic hardcore stuff. It's only 2 songs, I think. First EP, Looking Glass Self. I hate it because I decided I hated the high-end guitar thing that they were doing. And I didn't like the vocals and this and that. It was only one tempo and they didn't have any fast parts. I went back after many, many years of deciding I hated Looking Glass Self and revisited it, and I totally get why I loved it when it came out now. They were huge. They would play shows in my hometown and there'd just be a mass of bodies. Like a pyramid of human beings, a ziggurat of people writhing in front of the stage. And I get why. Like, yeah, it's a lot of like E chord crunching, but there's dynamics involved. Everything is well placed. The recording is excellent, and they do a high end like harmonic thing over a lot of their songs. The sort of high pitched guitar deal, and it works. You know, it's something different. They really place all their instrumentation in the right places. It's super heavy too. It's really good. But it's very emblematic of the early 90s, like no more fast parts. It's all chug, you know? But they're probably one of the very best to do it easily. And then we have Confusion, Storm the Walls, 90 to 94. This is a great compilation that I think has been a long time coming. It's been a cult band for a lot of people for ages now. I've had stuff by them on MP3, I want to say going back to like 2008 or something like that. The Drawn and Quartered blog. I used to get a lot of old, hard to find NYHC demos on. They're pretty important because they're one of the first bands out of New York in the early 90s to start incorporating a bit of death metal influence. You know, other people took some stuff from Slayer, Metallica, maybe, that kind of thing. But the members of this band were actively listening to and being influenced by death metal. Mike Scandato, I think the guitarist, he's still around, playing in bands, you know, posts on social media and stuff like that. And yeah, it's cool. I mean, you don't hear the influence so much in the earlier material, but definitely by the later stuff, you could tell they were listening to a lot of DM, which is cool. Then Damnation AD. I've loved Damnation AD for a long time, but I never got into this one. This is Kingdom of Lost Souls. It's their only record on Revelation. It's a lot more cleaned up than No More Dreams of Happy Endings, their first album. That first album is very dirty, in a good way. Gross guitar tone. It's got a lot of doom to it. It's a very atmospheric, and I try to use that word sparingly, but very atmospheric, depressive, metallic hardcore record. So is this, but this has a very clean crunch to it, a certain accessibility that I also appreciate, and I think it's worth your while to check this out. So this was a big one on my list that I had to check off. Kingdom of Lost Souls. It's the one with the tanks. All right. So that was a huge stack of stuff and a lot of rambling. I hope you stuck with me for the whole time. If not, I will not take it personally. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe. I should probably say that at the beginning of the video. Oh well. But I'm gonna get going. Gonna mix this all down, fix it all in post like you do. Where we are, have a good day, evening, weekday, or weekend. Keep at it. Have a good one. Be safe.